Hello and welcome. The dangers of being a humanitarian worker in Afghanistan are becoming clearer with each death and casualty. But why are they now being seen as legitimate targets? Well, part of the answer lies with the increasing militarization of aid. The killing last month of a British aid worker in a remote part of the country reignited the debate over the uncomfortable relationship between foreign humanitarian assistance and military operations. As the conflict in Afghanistan continues, Western forces have incorporated aid work into their overall strategy, blurring the once clear distinction between military personnel and humanitarian workers and creating an impression that they are now part of the US-led war. Well, this has made those doing developmental work targets of the Taliban, who say they've been co-opted by the military and are in essence, quote, humanitarian shields. Today we ask, can aid truly remain humanitarian when it's part of a military strategy? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Send an SMS or an email to the show. Well, joining me is Michael Hoffman, an Afghanistan country representative for Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. Despite the dangers, MSF emphasizes that the safest way to work in conflict is with the acceptance of the local community and without security. Also joining me from Los Angeles is Philip Sieb, Director of the Center on Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. He's written extensively on media and its impact on war and how diplomacy is conducted. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
Michael Hoffman, if I could start with you. MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, has returned 5 years after withdrawing from Afghanistan, after you had 5 workers killed. What's changed? What's let you return to that environment?
Mainly what changed is that the war has returned to Afghanistan quite extensively. In 2004, when MSF closed its programs, it was closed because 5 of my colleagues were assassinated in Badghis province in Afghanistan, but in fact most of the programs were already handed over because it was mostly a development context, which means post-conflict, not much of fighting. So in essence, in 2004 the job of MSF was already over. In 2007, 2008 it became clear that the war had reignited in most parts of Afghanistan, and that's what prompted MSF as an organization specializing, if you like, to provide medical care in difficult situations like situations of conflict. That we couldn't ignore anymore the extent of the conflict in Afghanistan, right. And that's why we went back with the program there.
But one thing is that for the Western audience, certainly there's always stories of successes taking place. The military obviously wants to promote the idea that its strategy is working, and there's a sense for a lot of people living outside, obviously, that there are safe areas and not so safe areas. From your perspective, how do you gauge where you can work and where you can't work?
Well, the gauging of where you can work depends on not so much the acceptance of the community, but the acceptance of those parties that are waging the war, that they will allow our workers, and that's expatriate medical doctors and nurses, as well as Afghan doctors, that they allow us to work in safety. So by definition we would try to set up health services in the conflict zones. So these are not safe places. There's a war going on, and I cannot guarantee to my teams that there won't be a stray rocket or a roadside bomb aimed at somebody else that might hit one of our vehicles. But what I try to guarantee is that all the parties that are fighting in that area have explicitly agreed that our activity is no threat to their military objectives, and so therefore they allow our people to work there in safety.
I will talk more about that and the issues that you faced in that respect. Let me bring in Philip Sieb here, though, sir. And let me ask you how well you think the counter-insurgency strategy, the COIN as it's called, is working, considering that it's been one of the most dangerous, one of the most violent, certainly, years since 2001 in Afghanistan.
Well, I don't think it's working very well so far, but there's really no alternative to that kind of strategy, because it is impossible, particularly in a war such as that in Afghanistan, to conduct a war without looking out for the civilians, because when you have an enemy that is in the Taliban that bases itself so firmly within the civilian population, it's just necessary to try to win that population away from the enemy. I think that takes a tremendous amount of time. There is obviously a great deal of mistrust of any foreign military force in the country. But the notion that you can run a war, particularly this kind of war, totally separate from engagement with the civilian community there, I think is unrealistic.
Well, so what about the civilian presence that has sort of tripled pretty much since COIN was enacted, and the relationship that those civilians have in terms of trying to provide aid and relief, their relationship with the military there? How do you best balance that, or what's the best way to balance their presence and the fact there is that conflict taking place?
Well, I think aid groups, and I should say I have the greatest respect for Doctors Without Borders and the terrific work that they do. Those aid groups should be allowed to do their work as unimpeded as possible. But at the same time, there are military and related security interests that the coalition forces are concerned with, and you cannot just say, well, the aid people can do whatever they want and we'll ignore them and we won't get into the aid business ourselves. That's an unrealistic approach to counterinsurgency. The fact is the key to the U.S. strategy there is to work with the civilian population, is to work with aid and development, and I don't think you can totally divorce the military from that. That again is unrealistic.
Michiel Hofman, let me ask you about this acceptance that you were talking about and the need to be accepted by all the parties involved in the conflict. What seems to be happening nowadays, or certainly in the last couple of years, is the sort of targeting of the humanitarian workers, because they're seen as being part of this, as we described, co-opted force, that they have some kind of connection, especially with the militarization of aid, where often the military is doing the work of humanitarian groups or similar work. How do you make sure that there is that distinction made? You're not legitimate targets as far as the enemy is concerned.
That's actually by adopting a more classic definition of humanitarian. I mean, at this stage, as you say correctly, everybody seems to be a humanitarian in Afghanistan. The governments are, the armies are, the opposition groups, they're all claiming to do humanitarian work. But if you look at it in a more classic sense, humanitarian actually means that you provide some independent from the parties in the conflict. You look at the basic needs and you try to provide them based on the needs. And that's in the end what gives you the acceptance. So practically speaking, that means for us to start running this hospital in Helmand, in Lashkar Gah, which is one of the most volatile provinces in Afghanistan. The first thing we had to do is to also visibly make this a neutral space, if you like. So we had to get an agreement from all the different armed people that were inside the hospital compound. There was British Army, there was American Army, there was private security companies protecting development workers. The only thing that was missing in this hospital was patients, because they were too afraid to come to the compound, because there was too many guns inside. So again, in practice, being a classic humanitarian action meant all those guns, regardless of who they belong to, because we can't differentiate between the different warring parties, they had to leave the hospital compound, so it became a safe place again for patients to come if they were sick. And it's a very practical way of looking at it, which goes actually completely besides the more political questions that are none of the business of Doctors Without Borders. We're just trying to provide medical care to everyone.
Right. Well, Philip Siebe, if I could ask you, listening to what Mr. Hofman had to say there, how does that complicate the military activity? And if the humanitarian groups are saying, listen, we need to work in an environment where there is no blurring of the lines, where we are distinctly humanitarian and basically the guns have to move out, we have to be able to deal with these patients. To what degree does that complicate what the military is trying to do there?
Well, it complicates it significantly, and the nature of warfare today, as we've seen in both Iraq and Afghanistan, is that you no longer have armies and armored columns sweeping across the countryside swiftly, and then follow-up activities can deliver the aid and the development assistance. It's all going on at the same time. And as Dr. Hofman indicated, there have to be some agreements reached between the combatants and those who are providing aid to try to operate as best they can alongside each other. And I think the key for Doctors Without Borders and other such organizations is that they retain their identity as independent. I agree with Doctors Without Borders' concern about statements coming from, say, American government officials that say we get our information from the people on the ground. There cannot be any suspicion that these organizations are doing intelligence work or anything like that. but there has to be coexistence, and there cannot be a total separation. That is not the way this war is being fought. And so both sides have to understand the needs of the other.
But then, Professor, I ask you, isn't there a real danger and a real problem by virtue of the fact that the military is doing so much developmental work? Shouldn't that be taken out of the hands of the military? It doesn't make sense to then have that kind of risk developed through the military being given the task of humanitarian work.
Well, I don't think you can go that far. I think, yes, it's very risky. War is a risky business, but at the same time, to say that the military should not provide assistance, first off, the whole counterinsurgency strategy is based on the idea that you can win the support of the civilian population. And if you look at history, I mean, there have long been instances of security policy dictating, in a way, humanitarian policy. The Marshall Plan was based on security policy. The Berlin airlift, which provided essential aid to civilians, was a military operation as well as an aid operation. There's a long string of such examples, and so I think, once again, it is unrealistic to say that you can totally divorce the aid operations from the classic military operations. The way the U.S. military is structured now, and clearly the expressed interest of Secretary of Defense Gage, General Petraeus, and others, is that there will be engagement with the civilian population. Now, I don't think that rules out the work that Doctors Without Borders and other such organizations do. There has to be an understanding that we do certain work, they do certain work, and by we and they, it doesn't matter who you're referring to, really, but there have to be some lines of demarcation between what the different organizations are doing. But at the same time, to say the military should stay totally out of aid and development is not the way that that modern warfare works these days.
We'll look at more of these the complications in just a moment. We're going to take a short break. When we return, more on how aid workers can best serve the victims on the ground without being seen as targets on the battlefield. More of our discussion when we come back. Welcome back. Obama's counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan has integrated relief and development into its war against the Taliban, but has aid become too politicized, and how can aid workers best serve the victims of war without being seen as legitimate targets? My guests are Médecins Sans Frontières representative in Afghanistan, Michael Hoffman, who argues that the success of humanitarian efforts depends on the absolute trust of local communities and the separation from military forces. And from Los Angeles, Professor Philip Sieb is director of the Center on Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. He's written extensively on the intersection of conflict, diplomacy, and the media. And as I get back to you, Michael Hoffman, two emails, if I could put these to you, from our viewers. One from Salam Derson in India, who says, many counter-insurgency organizations are disguised as aid agencies with agendas which are far from humanitarian. And a similar sort of follow-up from Heidi Lady in the UK, who says, the biggest risk to civilian aid workers occurs when military personnel pose as aid workers. How much do you find that to be on the ground? Of course, there is that blurring. As the professor said, there has to be some kind of compromise. There has to be some kind of common ground. But how does it complicate your work when this kind of thing happens? And how often do you get that to be the case?
Not so much the blurring from the military. The military have a military job to do, and they will behave like military. I can accept that, and that, of course, they put all kind of other efforts in terms of relief and development into their strategy. Both sides are doing that. I mean, it's called a counter-insurgency because it counters an insurgency, and both of them are actually battling for the hearts and minds for the civilians. So you have in one village you have a clinic run by the international forces, another you have a clinic run by the Taliban, and that's fine. It's their war. It's not my business. Where it becomes dangerous is where a lot of people claim to be doing humanitarian assistance, which means that you are working independently from the warring parties, whilst in fact they are part of a development or counterinsurgency strategy. And one example is for instance, this organization that the aid worker that was working for that recently was killed in Kunar. That's a private development organization who sign up to counterinsurgency contracts, whose compounds look like military compounds. And this is the blurring of the lines from the aid groups themselves that makes it difficult to work truly independently amidst a circus of people who are not being honest or genuine about their independence.
Okay, let me ask you one thing though. What is it that the military organizations or the aid, the sort of developmental groups that are tied to military organizations, what can they do that you can't do? Because from conversations I've had with people in the field, they say there are many things that those with military training or military background or that kind of association, they often have a support structure and skill set that can often be very helpful to the standard developmental agencies such as yourself, and things they can do that you can't do.
I have to correct you very strongly here. MSF, Doctors Without Borders, is not a developmental organization. We are not involved at all.
I meant humanitarian group.
Yeah, but there's a key difference there, because development work means building systems for existing governments. The humanitarian work means providing immediate needs, completely independent from the existing government. So there's a key difference here. But from development groups, of course, I don't deny that they're probably much better in building a bridge or building a road, or having a agricultural program in remote areas. The problem is only that if these programs are connected to a military force, it becomes very dangerous for the people that are the recipients of these kind of activities to actually make use of these programs, because they will get repercussions from the opposition. So although the quality of the work might be outstanding, British troops or the American troops or the German troops can build a beautiful clinic with a high standard medical equipment and well-trained doctors, but it's still a military structure. So people will be afraid to go to this clinic for fear of repercussions from an opposition party.
Let me bring in Philip Sieb again. And Professor, I wonder, you know, the USAID and actually aid developmental work like that from the US has often had an image problem in a place like Afghanistan. Can you see a situation changing where Afghans could actually accept what's on offer and that they don't see the work being done as a potential target?
Well, I think there's always going to be some suspicion, particularly of relief efforts that are tied to the military. But that said, if you're in some remote area of Afghanistan and you have a seriously ill child and the doctor who's available happens to be a U.S. Army medic, I think you will welcome the medical attention from that person. And there are capabilities, frankly, on both a small scale and large scale that military organizations have that some relief organizations do not. For example, when we saw the relief operation in the South Pacific several years ago after the tsunami, it was really a military operation in many senses of the word, because the military has the logistical capability to do that. But in terms of winning the trust of people, I think the way you win trust is, in addition to defeating the enemy, is to deliver what the people want. And again, if you have a sick child in the middle of Afghanistan and you can deliver medical assistance, and there are plenty of places where the military are present and relief organizations are not, I don't think you deny the person that help just because you say, well, we're the military, we don't do that. Go find yourself somebody from a relief organization. The military capabilities in terms of delivering that kind of assistance should be used to the fullest.
Professor, let me ask you a question about the relationship between the US and Afghanistan and the government of Afghanistan. Hamid Karzai, the president, has said that he would dissolve foreign security companies and pass on the job to the local police and local organizations. And aid agencies have said they'll withdraw $1 billion of funding and their actual work out there as well, the operations. What impact do you think this will have, and why would the president do this?
Well, without getting into the maze of Afghan politics too far, I think that he is interested for political reasons, which make very good sense, to try to diminish the amount of foreign influence, to make it clear that under his government can police the country on its own. I'm not sure that's realistic right now, but you can understand his political motivation for doing that. I think the aid and development organizations are concerned because they're not certain that the Afghan police or paramilitary organizations can provide the kind of security that they need.
Let me ask you, Michiel Hofman, then, how you see things progressing that will make your environment safer. How can, if as the professor says, this is the reality, that the work is being done on this side from groups associated with US military funding, how do you take yourselves out of the picture, but keep yourself on the ground and doing the work?
The most important part, and again I stress, is not the acceptance of the community. That is very nice, and of course that is also very helpful, but it is actually an acceptance of all the different warring parties that you are not part of the conflict, and so therefore they allow you to have your medical staff on the ground, on the spot, to deliver this more neutral type of medical care.
Does that mean you have to go and negotiate with them then? Does that mean you have
Absolutely.
to get involved in the middle of this?
Yes, the whole key to it is to have negotiations with the military leadership of all the warring parties, and then also not to differentiate between the US Army, the Taliban Army. From a purely humanitarian point of view, these are all people with guns, warring parties that have to agree to leave your hospitals and your staff alone. And it's only because we have reached such an agreement that we have now a big team of expatriate medical staff in Helmand providing this medical care. And here I have to actually contradict the professor. The opportunity to choose medical care that is not linked to the military. Because yes, of course, as an act of desperation, they might go to the military clinic, but this has repercussions for their families for years to come. And so looking for medical care in that, if you have to rely only on clinics that are run by the military, becomes an act of desperation. And the patients are telling us so, that they're happy that they now finally have an environment where they can get medical care where it is not linked to the military operations.
If you have become, though, targets, seen as targets, for example, by the Taliban, it complicates your efforts to try to negotiate with them. Just a quick thought, how have you managed to win their trust enough to go, or are you having to really seriously think about this now?
No, because I mean these agreements have been made in place. I mean the first and foremost question that any group in fact asks you is where do you get your money from? Right. And therefore Doctors Without Borders is in a position that we have a large amount of private funds so that we can refuse any government funding in an environment like Afghanistan. Well, and that helps a lot in these parties to accept that you are truly independent from the military effort.
Well, you know, there are so many more questions and never enough time. Michiel Hofman and Professor Philip Sieb, I thank you, sir, for joining us as well.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for being with us. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook where we keep you updated on our topics. Be sure to post your questions and comments so that we can pose them to our guests. On the next show, we speak with philosopher and cultural critic Slavoj Žižek on his latest book, Living in the End Times, which discusses the impending collapse of capitalism and why we need to replace it with a more radical system. Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.